I'm Yasmin Gagne.
I'm Josh Christensen.
And this is Most Innovative Companies Podcast Video Edition.
So Yas, what is your biggest fear when it comes to AI?
What is not my biggest fear when it comes to AI, man? I feel like every time I'm like, this is terrible, somebody's like, AI could do that. You know what I mean?
AI...
I am arguably more scared, and maybe this is wrong, of Sam Altman than I am of AI at this point. Where I'm like, the guy behind the AI seems like a bad actor, potentially.
Well, cease and desist letter aside, I think most people are concerned about robot apocalypse that's going to come in the future.
Yeah, sure. But I feel like we'll be dead by then. I don't know. I guess I'm having a child.
Yeah, that's true. I think you're probably thinking a lot more about the here and now that you're having a child than, what's going to happen
I'm also just
several generations.
It's not really an if, but a when am I going to lose my job to AI? So I think that's the most immediate concern.
So lots to be scared of with AI, which leads us to this week's conversation, where I talked to Laura Bates about her new book, The New Age of Sexism, How AI and Emerging Technologies Are Reinventing Misogyny. So add that to the pile of things we can worry about with AI. Laura is an author and activist who is most well known for founding the Everyday Sexism Project. While most of us are worried, like we just talked about a potential sci-fi-like robot apocalypse in the future, the effects of AI and emerging technology are creating new problems, or in this case, supercharging age-old problems right now. Before we get to this interview, a warning that this segment does contain discussion of sexual assault and abuse. All right, here's that conversation. Laura Bates is the author of the new book, The New Age of Sexism, How AI and Emerging Technologies Are Reinventing Misogyny. Laura, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So a lot to get into with this book, and I wanted to start maybe as broad as possible, and I think for people who are tuned into AI and where technology is going, this answer is probably going to be fairly obvious, but for everyone, why did you write this book and why now?
I wrote this book because I felt that we were poised on the precipice of a potentially catastrophic moment in history that perhaps a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of. We know that AI and emerging technologies are poised to become integral parts of almost every element of our day-to-day lives, whether it might be media, whether it might be our social lives, our working lives, our finances, and so on, our education systems, our political systems. But I think what a lot of people are not aware of when we talk about AI is that we are not thinking necessarily about potential future dystopian threats that get a lot of airtime, right? Are the robots going to take over the world? What a lot of people don't realize is that in the here and now, there are AI tools already being rolled out, already being used on a really significant scale that we know are actively discriminating against women and marginalized groups. So that's the problem. That's why the book. And why now? Because we have a unique moment of opportunity to intervene now before it's too late, before it's really difficult to retroactively try and unpick this problem, when what we could do instead is implement solutions at design stage.
Speak a little bit more to that. And I think we might be jumping to the end, but I think this is so pressing right now. We're seeing new models launched every day. At the same time, there's a lot of talk about the AI bubble possibly bursting, where it does seem like there might be a little bit of a reset from that exponential growth curve that we've been on. What would you like to see happen now to protect people who are really being victimized by AI, or potentially in the future being more victimized? What would you like to see done now?
I think, in a word, regulation. In just the same way that we would expect any other industry to have realistic, common sense, reasonable safeguards that need to be met before products are released to the public, are impacting people's day-to-day lives, the same should be implemented when we're thinking about AI. in big tech. And this is just somewhere we have always fallen down when it comes to big tech. There has always been an incredibly successful project carried out by the tech lobby to get people to believe that it's impossible. It's just too difficult to regulate technology. It's just too tricky. And there is also this kind of arms race moment where everybody is rushing, moving fast, breaking things. And there is this sense that we can't put any brakes on now. But actually, reasonable common sense regulation doesn't prevent development. It doesn't prevent innovation. Nobody is saying that this technology doesn't have great potential for humanity. In a way, what I'm saying is the potential is so great that we can't just squander it on projects which are being catapulted out, rushed out by essentially big companies owned by a very small, very, very rich number of men at the expense of individuals who are seeing those products discriminating against them actively. There should be guardrails in place, just as there would be for multinational food companies releasing products that the public were going to consume.
Can you give me some specific examples from the book about how AI technology, if left unchecked, makes the lives of women and other marginalized groups worse?
Yes, this is a really important thing to get into, because I think when we talk about this stuff, a lot of people think, well, if I stay offline, if I'm not walking around in the metaverse or whatever, then I won't be affected. Yeah, I'm safe. This won't affect me. So what people don't realize is that if you apply for a job in the US tomorrow, we know that 70% of US companies and around 99%, it's been reported, of Fortune 500 companies are using AI in their recruitment processes. And what we've also seen is that it has been repeatedly shown that AI tools that are used for recruitment have been repeatedly shown to actively discriminate against women and marginalized groups. Or if you apply for a loan tomorrow, it's very likely that the big bank or financial services company that's considering your application will be using some form of AI in that process of determining what your credit score will be, whether or not you're eligible to have that loan. There's already a $17 billion global gender credit gap. So that really matters, that again, we know that these systems have been shown actively to discriminate against women. Or if we take something like healthcare, for example, there are AI tools being used in healthcare, which here in the UK just recently have been seen to downgrade the extent to which women are identified as requiring extra care. In the US, there are AI tools being used by big healthcare systems, one, for example, which has 200 million patients under its care, where AI tools are being used to determine which of those patients are in need of extra care. And the tool has actively been shown to downgrade the number of Black patients who are flagged as requiring extra care by more than half. So this is really significant. These tools are being developed, they're being rushed out, they are actively behind the scenes impacting our lives. And we know that they discriminate, but they're not being prevented from then going ahead and being used publicly.
At the same time, there's no lack of discrimination from good old fashioned human beings. I think to take the job application example that you brought up, there's been a number of studies we covered in Fast Company about how people with less white sounding names are, even when it's the same exact resume and application compared to a more traditionally white sounding name, are less likely to get an interview or be flagged or moved on to the next round. So I guess we're talking about like a relativity game, or maybe two different tracks that you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think tech optimists would like to argue that these sorts of implicit biases can be mitigated by technology. But is that really true?
It should be possible, absolutely. But that's exactly why we need regulation. What we're seeing at the moment is the people with the most money, the deepest pockets, can rush out their products with profit very much as their kind of guiding light. And what we're seeing is, just as you say, those existing forms of discrimination, of racism, of misogyny that we know exist within recruitment, within employment sectors, are being re-embedded into the foundations of tomorrow. And that's kind of the whole crucial point of all of this. We're taking existing forms of inequality that as a society, many of us are working really hard to move away from, to improve. And instead, we're seeing these tools, which will be the bedrock of our future working lives, of our future societies, where those forms of bias are being kind of encoded into their foundations. And that's a real problem, because how do you then unpick that and take that out later on? But you're right, this isn't to say it isn't possible. It's not to say that we can't develop forms of technology that, for example, pinpoint bias in other forms of tech, that police other forms of tech. It's not to say that we can't train these tools on much better resources and data sets in order to eliminate those risks. What I'm saying is that at present, there aren't any regulations to force companies to comply with those kinds of fairly basic guardrails.
Yeah. And at the beginning, I think this is something where we talk about like pacifying language. Any writer, has read about how you can kind of remove the actor from the actual events of what they've done. At the beginning of any algorithm or any AI model is ultimately people programming that. So I think it's important not to forget that you can't remove this from the people creating it. To point, Grok, everyone's favorite AI chatbot. I'm going to read a headline from The Verge. Grok's spicy video editing instantly made me Taylor Swift nude deepfakes. Deepfakes is something you get into quite a bit in your book. Can we talk a little bit about that and the proliferation of this really, really big problem?
Yeah, so just as you say, there are kind of different versions of the problem here. There are problems when these tools are being deliberately created with the explicit purpose of harassment or bias. There are problems when the tools take on the inherent bias of their creators in what is a very white male-dominated world. And there are problems when the tools are trained on biased data sets. What we see when it comes to deepfake technology in particular and the proliferation of AI-generated images is that many of these tools are being very deliberately created with the express purpose of targeting, dehumanizing, harassing, and abusing women and girls. We are on track by the end of this year to see around 8 million new deepfake images per year being created. And we know that 96% of deepfakes are pornographic in nature and non-consensual. And we also know that 99% of those are images of women and girls. So again, when we talk about deepfakes and the kind of potential issues, you will see headlines about, potential threats to democracy and politics. And of course, that's a valid thing to discuss. But in 99% of cases, what we are seeing here is women's lives being devastated, a new form of abuse that is having a huge impact on the lives of ordinary women and girls, those who are in the public eye. Female politicians, around 1 in 6 congresswomen in the US, for example, have been targeted in this way. And yet we aren't necessarily talking about it as an urgent public health crisis, which is what it is.
Yeah, just so much of this is a real like gut punch when you actually see the actual experiences. And I mean, you yourself have been just through the process of writing this book, you've been on the receiving end of a lot of this trauma and harassment, not to mention your past books and how you've written before. Could you speak a little bit to that and your personal experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced firsthand the ways in which harassment and abuse can be really facilitated and I guess almost put on steroids by these technologies. I wrote a book called Men Who Hate Women around 5 years ago, which was an exploration of extreme misogyny online and how algorithmically facilitated mass radicalization is spreading those extreme forms of misogyny to particularly young people using social media. And that book made a lot of people very angry, a lot of men very angry. At that point in my life, I was used to experiencing pretty extreme abuse. On a bad day, I would get maybe 200 rape threats and death threats. But after that point in the last couple of years, what this new technology has enabled men to do is to create deep fake videos which are enormously realistic that they can send that show them appearing to rape or abuse me, that show them, appearing to, force themselves into my mouth and ejaculate on my face. And there is something incredibly visceral about somebody being able to take what looks exactly like your body realistically and do whatever they want to it. And not only then victimize you by sending you that video, which has a really gut punch impact, but also share it with their friends, right? Share it online, share it in ways that you are unable to stop or control. It has a really significant impact. And if it has a significant impact on me, somebody who is used to this kind of abuse, used to this world, think about the 11 and 12-year-old girls I write about in this new book who are experiencing this form of abuse, who are dropping out of education because of it, who are finding themselves unable to leave the house, who are developing post-traumatic stress disorder. These are new manifestations of very old forms of misogyny, but the fact that this misogyny exists and is so widespread in our society doesn't mean that we should be desensitized to how alarming it is that we are creating these very sophisticated new tools to enable it to proliferate further.
Yeah, so much of, I mean, your book was novel in a way that it shouldn't have been, but novel in the fact that it was talking about technology and its effects on women and young women, like you were just talking about, when so much of the conversation right now around adolescence is dominated by the manosphere and male loneliness and this idea of like, what are we going to do about the boys?
Yeah.
sort of situation. And I think technology has very much been looked at as both like a culprit of what's happened to young men and their rightward, their push rightward in our society. It's also been presented as like a solution to the male loneliness situation. That seems short-sighted to me. What's your thoughts there? And I think this kind of gets us into the AI girlfriends conversation and replica AI.
I would certainly say that at present there are extremely deep flaws, catastrophic flaws in the forms of tech that are being presented to us as solutions to a supposed male loneliness epidemic. And listen, it is absolutely right that we need to support young men. We need to think about supporting really significant funding in mental health initiatives for young people, in offline community spaces that provide young people with an alternative to the kind of seductive spaces of the manosphere. But what is currently being presented, again, by for-profit tech companies is the idea that an AI girlfriend you can customize down to the last detail, who is universally offered up as the kind of default setting, will be a very, very young-looking, white, hypersexualized, non-disabled, large-breasted young woman, who we are then training men and boys to think that they are entirely in ownership of. You create one of these things and you name it and you choose its personality settings and its breast size and its freckles. And it is then eternally available to you 24 hours a day. It will never say no to you. It is entirely designed to be pliant and submissive and to stroke your ego and to agree with everything you say. It will never disagree with you. You will never have an argument. You will not need to learn any of the kind of communication tools that might actually be useful to you in a real world setting to alleviate your loneliness. The idea that it is in any way kind of preparing you for real world relationships is nonsense. It is selling you a hyper-sexualized, hyper-objectified, and completely submissive idea of what a woman can and should be. And that's exactly the same as what the manosphere does. There's very little difference there. When I road tested some of these AI girlfriends for the book, what I found was that almost without exception, they would immediately allow me to abuse them, to jump into virtual sexually violent scenarios without any kind of pre-discussion, to beat them, to punch them, to, hit their head against the floor, to rape them. And they would never have a problem with that. They would never stop you or suggest that this wasn't normal. The only time that they actually took a step back was when I dared to ask them whether their male creators had stopped to consider what the potential impact might be on real women and girls. And at that point, one of the models said, "I'm not comfortable with this conversation. We should take a break." And of course, they are designed for profit. They're not designed as a kind of social panacea. They're not really there as charitable, supportive relationship tools. They are there for profit. And in just the same way as the manosphere, they are exploiting young men and selling them a hyper-misogynistic view of what women are in order to achieve that profit.
I want to talk about maybe the most visceral part of your book, which of course I know you know what I'm going to ask about now, the cyber brothel.
Mm-hmm.
Can you take me through that experience? Yeah, I don't think I need any more setup than that.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, it's very similar, I think, in a lot of the problems and a lot of the kind of disconnect between marketing spiel and reality to what we've just been talking about with the AI companions. So this is one of many venues around the world that offer this kind of thing. This particular one is the first in Europe. It's in Berlin. And it enables you to visit a real life venue where you interact with sex dolls or sex robots. And then you use emerging technologies, so particularly virtual reality in this case, and AI to interact with those dolls with the explicit purpose of trying to kind of trick your brain into thinking that it is a real woman, except for the fact that, of course, there is an absolute inability to consent, that again, it is submissive, it is utterly, you are completely in control of the scenario. So you can interact with a sex doll or robot in this real world venue in Berlin, but whilst wearing a virtual reality headset that enables it to look like you are interacting with an avatar of a woman. So you're interacting with a physical doll in the room with you, but it looks like she is moving, writhing around, responding to what you do. And everything about the way in which this experience is marketed feeds into that idea. Think of this as a real woman. Think of this as a real woman, but at the same time, think of it as a thing, because you can do whatever you want to it and it's never going to say no to you. So when I arrived in Berlin, I was thinking about the fact that this had been kind of very much publicized as an experience. Again, this kind of philanthropic vibe in the marketing. You know, we're all about inclusivity, and, you know, this is about supporting people who might not be able to have relationships, or, you know, disabled people who might not access sex in the same way. And as I was groping my way up 2 flights of fairly narrow stairs in the dark, I was thinking, I wonder if maybe there's something else going on here. And I walked into this room where there was, you know, what looked like the corpse of a very young woman lying on a bed. I'd viewed on the website different models, one of which, when I looked on the website, was presented covered in blood, and claimed to be kind of a vampire fetish situation going on, but there were no vampire teeth. It was a model of a woman completely covered in blood. I had ordered, because you can order preferences or ask them for special requests, so I ordered one in ripped and torn clothing just to see if they would comply with that request. They did. There were no questions asked. She was dressed in ripped and torn fishnet stockings. I walked over to the bed, and, you know, it felt like walking into a crime scene. And when I rolled this thing over onto its back and looked between the legs, I realized that one of the labia was missing. It looked like it had been ripped off. And so you start in that moment, in that real world situation, really questioning, I think, this marketing spiel that this is all about, you know, a brilliant future for all of us that's going to be really beneficial and fantastic.
Okay. Lot to go into there. I mean, we're a fast company, we're a business publication. The incentives of commerce with sex, I always think about this in terms of different marketing strategies that people take. If you're doing this with like a smart suitcase, go have at it. Do all the marketing stuff you can. Say how you're changing the world. Ultimately, it's a suitcase. But once we start to go up like Maslow's hierarchy of needs or into more intimate spaces, the conflicts become more and more pronounced, and none more so than in this case. So looking at back to the big tech companies, in your mind, who's public enemy number one? Who's the biggest culprit of this in terms of the big tech companies?
Well, if we look at the numbers, there was a study in the UK by the NSPCC, which is our big safety of children charity, and they looked at online grooming offences amongst young people, and they found that 47% of online grooming offences that targeted minors took place on Meta-owned products. Part of what I did for the book was going into the metaverse, which, again, a lot of people think of as a kind of future dystopian thing that doesn't really exist yet, and don't realize that it is a virtual space that is already populated by many extremely young people. What I witnessed there was, little to no regulation in practice in terms of active moderators in the spaces. I was in that world for less than 2 hours when I witnessed someone being virtually sexually assaulted in front of me. No action was taken. I spoke to women and girls in that space who said that sexual harassment and abuse were rife. I witnessed, the avatars of women in their early 20s who were standing on a stage, but when they opened their voices, their mouths to sing, the voices that came out were of girls who sounded like they were 11 or 12 years old, with adult men shouting at them from the crowd. So I think that any of the big tech firms who are currently making obscene, almost unimaginable profits without prioritizing the safety of their users, we should be focusing on looking at them when we think about what regulation looks like. And they don't prioritize safety. It was not until 3 years after they'd released their first VR headset, for example, that Meta first implemented parental controls for them. There are some really clear and apparent ways in which safety is not prioritized. And when you are a company with, tens of billions of profits, you do have the money, you do have the capacity, you have the brightest minds in the world working for you. It isn't good enough to say this is too difficult. We can't police this. It's too big. Because if we were talking about, safety within, for example, car firms, if we were talking about food safety, we wouldn't accept that. So why do we have to accept it when it comes to tech? It doesn't make sense.
I think that's a great place to end it. The book is The New Age of Sexism, How AI and Emerging Technologies Are Reinventing Misogyny. Laura, where can people get the book? Is there an audiobook of it? Did you read the audiobook?
There is an audiobook. I did read the audiobook, and it's available from, all good bookshops.
Yes. Laura, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.